Welcome to the State of the Markets podcast. I'm Paul Rodriguez of ThinkTrading.com.
I'm Tim Price of PriceValuePartners.com.
And our very special guest is Karim El Ayoubi. Karim, welcome to the show.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Lovely to be with you.
It's absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited. I've ordered a copy of your book. It's on the way. I haven't got it yet, but I want to hear all about your journey into the world of finance, and it is a fascinating one.
Thank you very much. If you want the brief history, I studied PPE at Oxford, like so many people do.
Well, what college?
Pembroke.
Oh, at least it wasn't Balliol.
The only reason I went to Pembroke was because my housemaster at school suggested that would be one I could get into. And that was about as much thought as I put into the whole process. I was far too busy having lots of fun in London as an 18-year-old at the time.
For people who don't know Oxford, yours truly was at Christchurch. So we regarded Pembroke as our coal scuttle.
Well, it is right across the road, yeah.
Right.
And there was talk of launching missiles from Tom Tower at Pembroke in case they got out of line.
Could this get heated? By the way,
No. I think enough time has passed.
No, it's a good job. It's just over Zoom, because otherwise it could end up with fisticuffs.
Fisticuffs.
Yeah,
it's all good. I mean, look, 3 years at Oxford was a very enjoyable experience, and of the three, economics was my first love. I really liked the maths. I liked the sort of the scientific approach, and also this idea of maximizing social welfare, of making the average person better off, which is how economics is couched. That really appealed to me because I've always had this sort of instinctive support for the underdog, and just this desire that ordinary people should be better off. Economics appeals for all of those reasons. And then I left Pembroke and I went to work for some of the banks in the city. In
what capacity?
Back office stuff, so operations, fixed income operations. It was a means to an end for me. It wasn't something I was passionate about. I kind of fell into it because I never knew what I wanted to do with my life. So don't you think that's the absurdity of things, that you're meant for traditional reasons or cultural reasons, whatever it might be, to have a strong view about what you want to do, but at the age of 20, 21, 22, no one has a clue what they want to do with their life. Absolutely. I was always
and by definition you can't know what you want to do when you haven't done it.
Well, exactly. I mean, how can you know what job you want to do until you've tried them all? I was always slightly amazed by other kids that I was at school with, that hi, I'm Philip, I'm 14 years old, but I know I want to be a doctor. I'm like, how do you know that at 14? How could you possibly know?
Well, I want to specialize in fixed income back office settlement.
Yeah. So I kind of fell into that, and as much as you're not at the coalface in the back office, you start to get this sense that, well, this doesn't really match up with the efficient markets hypothesis that you're taught in economics. But it wasn't really until I learned how to trade and started trading with my own money and started reading articles by all sorts of interesting people. One of them was called Tim Price. Yeah, you might have heard of him.
He really gets around.
He certainly does.
Like a bad cold.
And everybody that writes about the markets understands that what moves them is as much human emotions as anything else. That all of these fund managers, with all of their research assistants and all of the information that they have at their fingertips, they all move in a herd-like fashion. They all respond to the incentives that they're given. And you hear over and over again how most fund managers would rather be wrong with the crowd than risk standing out and being right. And so, again, none of this fits with what you learn at university. And you learn that the real world is dominated by imperfect knowledge, as opposed to the one of the primary assumptions of neoclassical economics, and also uncertainty and risk. And economics just doesn't, it's certainly not the economics I was taught at university, didn't really deal with those subjects at all. The other thing you realize, as soon as you start looking at any charts of economic data, whether it's GDP or inflation or unemployment, that's immediately what jumps off the page at you is that they're cyclical in nature. And the sort of static equilibrium models that they teach you in university cannot generate cycles by definition. They generate a static equilibrium as their only possible outcome. And so when you look at a world that is fundamentally cyclical in nature, there is only one conclusion, which is that the static equilibrium model does not capture reality. So you have to look for something else.
So was it the trading that didn't fit in with economics? Because when I started out I taught myself technical analysis, and when I went into, I learned economics as well, and I thought this is all very interesting theory, but it doesn't sound like this is the real world. Then when I went into the city, I thought, look, this is going to be great. I'm going to meet loads of economists who are going to be so much smarter than me, and I'm going to learn loads from them. And I realized that they just did not have a clue what they were talking about. They got the markets wrong all the time, but never seemed to change their view. And it was just watching the markets from a trading perspective that taught me that. It sounds like that was a similar kind of experience, because once you learn about trading, you're forced to, you can't just sit in your ivory tower of your opinion. You have to get it right.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, the minute that you sit down in front of a live chart of a large blue chip company and you see that the share price of this company is ticking up or down every minute of the day, and yet what economics teaches is that the share price is basically a discounted value of the future cash flows of that company. And so the only thing that moves share prices according to economics is a release of new news that would affect your calculation of that future cash flow stream. Well, you look at a blue chip company, they might not have released any news for 3 months, but the share price is ticking up or down every minute, if not every second of the day. And so there's clearly something else going on there other than what economics teaches.
Well, the thing is, I'd say some of this is down to problems with semantics, because we're using this word economics, but whose economics? Because Keynesian economics is way different from Austrian school or classical economics, which is different from modern monetary theory economics. So it's like, whose economics do we value? And
Yeah.
I suspect we're maybe on a similar page, but I mean, I never studied economics formally. So what I got through learning on the job, through experience and the real life and the real market experience. So I was fortunate enough to miss a lot of the sort of naff irrelevant book learning. And I'd say, my career became complete, my worldview became completely transformed when I stumbled upon, I had the good fortune to meet people who were classical or Austrian school sympathizers, and that's how the world really works. Because if I was to sum it up, and I don't want to sort of take away from your own experience, Karim, but or the book we'll get onto quite soon, I hope. But there's Keynesian stuff, which is basically statistical nonsense, and then there's how the world actually works, which is the market is not an abstract machine or an engine. The market is 7 billion people all interacting with each other. Well, good luck modeling that.
I mean, I think you can. You just can't do it from the starting point of mainstream economics, which is the static equilibrium model. You can definitely analyze the macroeconomy, and in terms of modeling the markets, well, yeah, I mean, what they teach in economics was sort of day one was, well, first we're going to spend a term teaching you microeconomics. We're going to model individuals and firms and how they operate. And then we're going to aggregate upwards, and that's going to give us a model of the macroeconomy. The problem is that every step in that process is then done wrongly, and the aggregation doesn't work. But I do think it is possible to model the markets. And certainly when you listen to interviews with enough fund managers, you will hear them over and over again say, we use a proprietary model. Don't try saying that too quickly. But you always hear about proprietary models. People have developed their understanding of the markets based on market data, not based on what anybody learned in university. So, yeah, you're right, Tim, that there are lots of different schools of economic thought. When I say economics as a catch-all term, what I mean is mainstream or orthodox economics, which sort of includes neoclassical and Keynesian. I, I gather from what you said, you might be more of a fan of Austrian economics.
Sure.
I'm not, because the starting point of Austrian economics is exactly the same as neoclassical, which is this is a theoretical model only. All of our insights come from theorizing. We reject empirical study. And I think actually, if you want to get anywhere in understanding the real world, you have to adopt the scientific method. And the scientific method is all about observing the real world first, come up with a hypothesis about how, such and such a relationship works, then go and test it against empirical data.
Well, it has to be falsifiable, which takes us to people like Karl Popper.
Right. I'm not too familiar with Popper's work, to be honest.
He's a philosopher, basically, and he was a big influence on George Soros in terms of the way he looked at markets, and it comes down to, really, I think, we're kind of all looking at the same thing, which is that the market is far more psychological and looking at human nature and how humans respond to certain situations. Everyone's got to have their own model of how that's going to work and how it's measured. And I've met many economists who looked at economics and said, right, this doesn't work, but I'm going to develop my own style of reading what I think does actually represent what's happening in the economy, which is what I would call the market economists, and they become far more successful in their predictions because they've adjusted. But what was really fascinating, or what is fascinating, is obviously from your point of view, you looked at the economics, you said, this doesn't work. You didn't just carry on with, almost living the lie of, right, I'm going to get a nice job with a big investment bank and just continue pumping out reports where I have no skin in the game. I'll just make a lot of money. You actually said, no, this doesn't work. I want to work out how it does work and getting to the truth, which I think is very admirable. And then you've written a book about that whole process, actually correcting people, teaching how people should be approaching economics, which is no mean feat to do in one book, but you've done it.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it all started off with a chance interview I came across on YouTube in, I think, 2016. And it was RT interviewing Richard Werner. And it's interesting that it was RT that interviewed Richard Werner and not, say, the BBC, whose job it is to educate the British public.
Well, educate, inform, and entertain.
Yeah. Well, they certainly
inadvertent
don't do much
entertainment seems to be the primary driver now.
Yeah.
Well, entertain themselves, maybe.
So this interview with Richard Werner was only about half an hour, and in it he talks about the importance of money creation and where money actually comes from, and then the importance of where the money flows to. And he identifies three broad categories of people who can receive new money. And new money, as you guys probably know, comes through bank lending. Banks create money when they extend loans to people or firms. And so
it's created for anyone that's listening, it's created out of thin air.
It is. And because banks have complete control over their lending policies, they get to control who gets that new spending power. And that really determines everything that happens next. And Werner identifies broadly three categories of borrowers. You've got people who buy assets, and the largest class of those are home buyers. We all have to have a home, and most of us have to get a mortgage in order to be able to buy one. So mortgage lending is the biggest sector of bank lending in the UK and probably in most economies. You also have people who buy financial assets, and they tend to be hedge funds or other financial institutions. And they can go to banks and borrow money, and they can use that money to buy financial assets in the financial markets. And so what we've seen since financial deregulation began in the 1970s, and since banks became allowed to get into the mortgage market, because prior to 76, they were not allowed to lend mortgages. you had to go to a building society in the 70s if you wanted to borrow a mortgage. And building societies were restricted. They could not create new money. They could only lend you money that had first been deposited with them, which is why house prices were so stable up until the 1970s. And then we had this financial deregulation, and banks got into the mortgage game, and they started creating new money when they lent mortgages. And that new money has gone into the housing market. And what did we see since the mid 70s, and especially since the Big Bang deregulation in the 80s? It was the exponential rise in house prices, which has been continuing right up to this present day. We've seen a similar phenomenon in financial markets. If you look at a chart of, say, the S&P 500 and identify the periods of QE on that, you see that every episode of quantitative easing, which represents new money flowing into the financial markets, that was also associated with a rapid increase in stock prices. So if you give new money to asset buyers, they will go out and they'll bid up the price of assets, because at any moment in time, the supply of assets is fixed. So, new money can only then feed into higher prices. The second category of borrowers who can receive new money is consumers, and consumers will borrow money and use it to go out and buy a car or a holiday or other, goods and services. And to the extent that the economy can provide an increase in goods and services, then you'll get an increase in GDP. And once the economy reaches capacity, then any more money given to consumers has to eventually feed into rising prices. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah. So
And then
you've described the first phase is described as the Cantillon effect, isn't it? Where people who are closest to the money bid up the prices of those assets that they're able to buy with it.
Yeah. And because the supply of assets is essentially fixed at any moment in time, extra money can't feed into an increase in the amount of assets being traded. It can only feed into higher prices. With consumers, because firms in the economy generally have unsold stock, if I was a benevolent central banker, for instance, and I look at the British economy today and it's flagging quite badly. Growth is near zero. Unemployment's been ticking up every month since August 24. So if I'm a benevolent banker and I've got a way of giving money to ordinary people in the UK, I might think to myself, well, you know what? I could probably give this economy a bit of a boost by print up a load of money out of thin air, give it to all of the people. And if I give everybody £1,000, they're going to go out and spend it. And that would, in the first instance, result in products that are sitting on shelves getting bought. So you'd see an increase in GDP in the first instance. But maybe I think, well, that went really well first time. Maybe I can do it again and again and again. And eventually what you find is that there aren't any more products sitting on shelves waiting to be bought. Firms can't increase their output anymore. And so all of that extra money eventually gets bid into higher prices.
Or if you're not producing goods yourself, then it will actually be buying up goods from abroad, which is not the best way to do that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Very true. And very relevant to our situation today, with China being the world's factory. Okay, so this brings us to the third broad category of borrowers, and that is firms and entrepreneurs. And firms and entrepreneurs, when they borrow money, are usually doing so either to fund working capital or to fund expansion or even fund a startup. And so in this situation, you get an increase in the money supply, which tends to be inflationary, but you get a simultaneous increase in the amount of goods and services that are offered into the market. So the amount of things that are traded for money increases in parallel with the amount of money. And so you get stable prices, but you get an increase in GDP transactions. The other bit that I like to add to this is an insight taken from MMT, which is that, effectively one person's spending is another person's income. So money flows around the economy. So when a firm receives money in revenue, it pays some of that money to its workers. Well, those workers also happen to be consumers, so they go out and they buy goods and services, and so that money flows back round to the companies in the economy again. So yeah, you once you start looking at the economy through the lens of money, you start to see how it all fits together. And you start to see the importance of where money comes from and where it flows to. And this really highlights the role of the banks, which we saw in a spectacular fashion in 2008, 2009. Everyone's familiar with the story of the GFC, in which the banks created way too much money, funneled it to house buyers, including house buyers that didn't have the salaries to support the repayment of those loans. So they blew up this huge bubble in the asset market known as the American housing market. And eventually, like all bubbles, that bubble burst. And then because of the importance of banks in lending to consumers and to firms, the collapse in their the collateral of the loans that they'd written meant that banks reined in their lending. And so this event that happened in the housing market then spread to the consumer credit markets and to firms who need to borrow money from banks to survive day to day. And so once you bring into your understanding of the economy, money, credit, and banking, you can understand very easily the great financial crisis. And you can understand very easily the Great Depression, which was exactly the same dynamic, except it happened with US stocks rather than US houses. But it was exactly the same story.
But I'd say the difference for the Great Depression was that banks were allowed to fail, whereas in '08, Lehman was put to the sword, but everyone else was bailed out.
Very true. And it was the fact that you had this inconsistent policy response from the various Federal Reserves in America, because there's not one, there's a dozen, and they responded differently in 1929. And so that led to what looked initially like an improvement, and then you had the collapse of a large conglomerate, and I forget the name off the top of my head, but it is in the book. But you had this rolling series of collapses of banks, and that's why you did not, the Great Depression dragged on and on. And it wasn't until FDR got in 1933, implemented not just the New Deal, but the key step that he took was to get America off the gold standard, which would allow him to make a significant both fiscal and monetary expansion, which would stimulate the economy. But also then they closed all the banks down for a weekend, in which they were doing whatever they called it back in the day, stress tests. And then they sort of reopened on Monday and said, right, we've checked all the banks, everything's fine now. And the idea was to restore confidence in the banks so that people stopped trying to take their money out of the banks, causing bank runs. So there were some, three key actions there: was the getting off the gold standard, the monetary and the fiscal expansion, and the sort of reestablishing confidence in the banks. And that's what stopped that was the start of the end of the Great Depression.
There is a counter view, which is that Roosevelt's intervention perpetuated the Depression, and what really brought America out of the Great Depression was the Second World War.
Yeah, I don't buy that, and I don't think the data supports it. I think stopping the rolling bank failures from 1933 on was absolutely key. And it's only if you're trained in conventional economics to ignore the role of money, credit, and banks, then you have to start looking for other explanations.
So where did you see this working? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut in.
No, that's sort of, I got to the end of the point. That's fine. I suppose if you want a good contrast, if you want to, to compare and contrast the Great Depression to the GFC, and I think this supports my argument, which is that the big difference between the Great Depression and the GFC was that in the GFC we had a concerted response by the central banks, who injected a whole load of money into the banking system to re-liquidize the banks. And so that eventually, once the confidence issues were overcome, the banks could restart lending to each other and to the rest of the economy. And that's why the GFC was over much, much quicker than the Great Depression. It was
because I would take a contrary view, which is that the GFC is with us now, that we should never have allowed the banks to be bailed out. They should have been allowed to fail. And all that the GFC effectively brought in ushered in a period of crony capitalism. But I'd go further. I'd say all the banks should have been allowed to fail. But then I don't believe in central banking either. The reason I say this is because central banking equates to basically a get out of jail free card for banks. So banks aren't allowed to operate the same way everybody else does, which is if you make bad decisions and fuck up, you fail. But
Yeah.
banks mysteriously are somehow deemed to be too precious for that kind of dirty business type approach to be valid. And so what central banking to me represents is top-down technocratic statism, and that was discredited after the failure of the communist experience in China and Russia. And yet it's alive and well in central banking, and that to me is something I can't reconcile.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I agree with you about centralization. What makes modern China, and indeed, the Japanese economic miracle and the other economies that have followed that moral model, what their power, where their power lies is in the fact that yes, they have a powerful central government, but they have this huge decentralized banking system, which operates a little bit like the cardiovascular system in the body, right? You have, the major organ at the center, the heart. You've got some major arteries, but then it breaks down. You have the ever smaller arterioles and capillaries, which become smaller and smaller, and they deliver blood to every part of the body. And we need ideally a banking system which does the same. And in the UK, certainly we have gone in the wrong direction because we now have a banking system that's but completely dominated by the big four or big five banks. And we have very few building societies, and we don't have any credit unions that are to speak of. And
Because
if you
that's
look
one of
at,
the policies you get to as a policy solution in the book, which is
it is.
we need more banks.
Yeah,
We need
absolutely.
more banking competition, more specifically.
Yeah, much, and we need more diversity in the banks, and we've got to a point
So
now
it's
where
rather a shame that it's more difficult to open a bank in the UK now than it's ever been in history.
exactly. I mean, it's said that if you print out the UK banking code and on pieces of A4 paper and pile them up, it would be as tall as Nelson's column, and clearly no one person can accumulate that much knowledge. So you have to have these huge compliance teams and compliance departments, which means that new entrants into the banking market are incredibly rare. And actually, what we need is a regulatory environment where somebody can start up a new bank every week, because you need this constant creation of small banks. Because, again, one of the insights that comes from Richard Werner is you tend to find that big banks like to do big deals with big borrowers. And medium-sized banks will tend to do medium-sized deals with medium-sized borrowers. And small banks, if you're a small firm, if you're a window cleaner or you want to open a dry cleaning shop or something, you're not going to go to Goldman Sachs, right? The capital markets are closed to you. You need a small local bank or a small local credit union that'll provide you the funds to start up that small business. So really what you need is a banking system that, as successful banks grow and they become medium and then large banks, they're getting replaced by this constant generation of small banks at the bottom of the tree.
And they should also be protected then, because what would happen is the bigger banks would just go, oh, actually, we're going to start buying the smaller banks, and then you'll end up with this problem again.
Yeah, we need a competition commission that actually does its job.
Yeah. So given that, do you think that potentially allowing banks to print their own money is that not the root of the problem? Shouldn't maybe, I'm going to say maybe the government, and knowing that that's probably not a good idea either, maybe the government should do it. And
I mean, this is, sorry to cut in, Paul, but this is fascinatingly relevant because it's exactly the debate that's happening in the US right now, which is who controls the banking system. Is it the Fed or is it the Treasury? And it's quite clear what Trump thinks, and it's not the Fed.
It also shouldn't be the Treasury as such. And what is widely regarded as the most successful central bank of all time was the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank is a central bank. It performs the roles that you need a central bank to do, which is to enable settlement of trades and transactions between the various commercial banks, to provide liquidity to the system when needed. But crucially, the Bundesbank remained accountable to the German parliament. And I think we took bank independence too far. I think we should have a committee of people with relevant skills in parliament, and that committee should have direct oversight of the Bank of England. So I don't believe in total independence of the Bank of England, but I think Also, stopping someone like Boris Johnson from being able to turn on the money taps because he thinks it would be politically popular to do. It's probably a good idea. So we don't, the central bank has a printing press. I don't think we should let the politicians have control of the printing press, but also don't think we should have a central bank that doesn't answer to anyone.
So smaller banks should be allowed in this model to be able to print their own money.
You need a proliferation of banks, a vast proliferation of banks. Yeah.
So when I was asking the question about where has this worked before, I was kind of referring to your studies of the best model of an economy performing extremely well, which I believe was your study of the Japanese market.
Yeah, again, I'm going to give credit where it's due to Richard Werner on this one. So he did his postgraduate studies in Japan. He was working for Jardine Fleming and the Bank of Japan. And so through that, he was able to conduct interviews with people from the very top of the Bank of Japan right down to sort of local branch managers in commercial banks. And he put together a picture of how the banking system worked and how this fed into the success of the rest of the economy. And essentially, the Japanese economic miracle was predicated on one policy, which was known as, well, in Japan, they called it window guidance. We would call it credit guidance. But it was literally because the bank managers would go to a window at the Bank of Japan to be given their quotas for credit for the quarter. And the Bank of Japan would tell the commercial banks, right, you will grow your lending by so much this year, and you will prioritize lending to firms who produce goods for export, was number one. Firms who produce capital goods was number two. Firms who produce goods for domestic consumption was number three. And way down at the bottom of the pile, you had consumer lending and mortgages. Banks were actively discouraged from growing their lending to consumers and to house buyers, which is why house prices in Japan never shot up, and their inflation remained low. So from 1945 to 1973, the Japanese economy grew at 10% a year, every single year, with near zero inflation and zero recessions. And this was because our economies, the way they're structured is we run on credit. If you want to start up a new business, you need credit. And so they had a system that directed credit to the most productive purposes. And so Japan recovered from the devastation of World War II, having had two cities flattened by atomic bombs in 1945. And within a few decades, it became the second largest economy in the world, to the point that the Americans were telling the Japanese, hey, you're growing too fast. You have to reform your system to become more like us.
I mean, that's an extraordinary thing for America to have done. So they basically said, look, you're doing extremely well. We need to clip your wings.
Yeah. Rather than saying, you guys are doing really well, what's your secret? They said, hey, it was almost a little bit mafia-like. It's like, hey, you guys are doing a little bit too good here. You better slow down or we might have to break your legs.
Yeah.
So the Japanese came under a lot of pressure, and also a lot of their economists were trained in the West. And so they went back to Japan with these neoclassical ideas about free markets and about the irrelevance of money, credit, and banking. And so they ended up shooting themselves in their foot. They changed their lending policies, which led to the enormous real estate boom in the 1980s and then the crash at the end of the 80s, early 90s. But again, it's a really good demonstration of this idea that who gets the new money really matters, because Japan stopped lending or stopped prioritizing lending to businesses who were producing goods for export, and they started prioritizing lending to real estate developers and real estate speculators. And so that's how you end up with this huge real estate bubble coming out of nowhere and becoming, unfeasibly large.
So you have the answers. This is what gets me. And you, in a beautifully simple model, you've explained exactly how it works, why it's done this. Why do you think our government, the Japanese government, haven't just realized this themselves and said, why can't we just go back to this model that worked?
The Japan's ongoing failure to me is a real mystery, and it's not something I have an explanation for, other than the power of ideology, and the fact that so many of Japan's economists and central bankers have been trained in the West and then gone back to Japan with these wrong think ideas. What's interesting is that not Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping, who became the president of China in 1979. He visited Japan in 1978, and he asked the Japanese, "Look, your economy's been so strong for so many years. What's the secret?" And they told him, "Well, you need to create many, many, many more banks, and you need to make sure that the banks are directing the fuel of the engine of the economy, which is credit, to the engine of the economy, which is your small and medium-sized enterprises and your startups." And so Deng Xiaoping implemented that policy. The very first thing that he did on becoming president was institute the creation of 2,000 new banks right across China. Many of those are state-owned banks, but many of them are private banks. But as we all know with China, the central government ultimately wields the stick. So if the central government says, right, you're going to go out and you're going to increase your lending by 10% this year, and you're going to prioritize entrepreneurs and startups and businesses that want to expand, well, that's what happens. And that's how China then gets 10% per annum growth for the next 30 years.
The situation in China is actually fascinating in terms of how their local government used to take the revenue from the land sales. So the rent would go to the local government, and that's how each area got funded. But then the central government decided that they would take 70% of that, leaving them with a shortfall. So what's happened now is they've got the situation where the local government hasn't got the money to fund what they need to fund for local projects, obviously. So what they have to do is they have to push the property market up further and further in order to create enough money, because it's all gone to the central government, which is a huge problem coming down the pipe in a few years' time. Because what you're going to have with fewer people, with fewer couples having children, you're going to have an aging population. Therefore, they won't be buying more property, and because individuals can't invest anywhere other than in the local market, those individuals have been buying more and more property. There's nowhere else to put your money, so they buy property 2, 3, whatever, 4, and then when they age, where does it go to? So you've got this twin problem coming down the pipe where it can't be sustained, because they've kind of messed with the model by not allowing local governments to be funded themselves. And it's
so they also messed up by inserting a one-child policy that's now backfired spectacularly. So the Chinese population is now shrinking, and it may never recover.
Yeah,
this is
so
true.
The idea that China gets old before it ever gets rich.
I mean, I think they've already got rich. Judging on some of the reporting I've seen out of China in the last year or so, their middle class is doing very, very well. They're doing.
But it's having a tiger by the tail, because the moment that wealth creation process goes into reverse, the guy in charge isn't in charge anymore, because the people will say will revolt.
I think this brings us to one of the issues which I talk about a bit in the book, but not a huge amount, which is how do we get out of this debt trap that we're in? Because the problem is that you have to have growth in money to be able to have economic growth. But all of our growth in money comes
in a debt-based fiat system.
Yeah, all of our growth in money comes about through growth in debt. So basically, our economic growth is tied at least 1-for-1, if not worse, to growth in debt. And so, you
And
see
this
that
and the system cannot survive deflation.
the system can't survive deflation, but equally, it can't keep inflating forever because at some point you have to, at least individuals and firms have to repay their debts. So, if we were to maintain the current paradigm, then the only way you can have ever increasing debt is if the government is the one that has the ever increasing debt, because private individuals and firms can't have ever increasing debt. We have to repay our debts to the banks. So if we're going to have growth, somebody has to create the money, right? Well, there's only two options. It's either the private sector or it's the public sector. Well, we've just established the private sector can't have ever expanding debt. So that means then the only way you get continued growth is for the government sector to continue expanding its debt. That's the only option.
But that's not real growth. I'd argue that's Potemkin growth, because anything that government's involved with is government. Government is the worst capital allocator in the world. So that whatever government touches turns to ash. You've got ever increasing bureaucracy at some point, and I think we're there now in the commodities market. The likes of gold and silver are saying this game is up now.
I'm not saying that government should keep expanding. I'm saying that the injection of new money should come from the government.
But just
There's a
increasing
slight
the money
difference.
supply is not growth. It's simply inflationism.
Well, in a world in which you have basically a closed loop economy, right? And if any point in that closed loop, you can inject money anywhere in the loop and it will flow around to the other destinations in the loop. So, for instance, as I said earlier, you can lend money to companies. Well, those companies will pay salaries to their workers, and those workers will then go out to the shops and they'll spend their money on goods and services, and they'll pay some of it in tax to the government. So it doesn't matter where in the system, to an extent, it doesn't matter where in the system you inject money, it's going to flow round to the other parts of the system. However, as I've outlined already, it's preferable to inject your money into the economy to firms because, well, for two reasons. When a firm invests in a new to expand its production, that investment creates a new revenue stream, and so a firm can repay its debts out of that new revenue stream. Whereas if you or I, Tim, borrow money from the bank so that we can spend it today, it means we have to cut our spending tomorrow to be able to repay that loan. Firms don't have that problem. So it is vastly preferable that we grow our money supply by lending to firms. But equally, governments don't have that problem because governments can roll over their debt to infinity.
But that doesn't mean they can secure the store of value qualities of their currency.
No, that's also true. But again, the value of the currency is tied to the amount of goods and services that are available in the economy.
I mean, the way I look at the thing is we're now in the thing to recognize or appreciate is that the entire financial system globally has shifted from being in so-called stable equilibrium to unstable equilibrium, if it were ever stable. And the problem is that the debt-based monetary fiat system is the problem that masquerades as solution. So the system's now breaking down. And to coin a phrase used by one of our guests a while back, Lawrence Leopard, fix the money, fix the world. If you have unsound money, you have an unsound system. End of story. So I'd be for anything that gives us sounder money than what we've currently got, because the current model seems the worst of all possible worlds.
Okay, sound money is an interesting topic.
So to go back to very briefly to an earlier point in the discussion, when did you have a more perfect system? Well, it was the 19th century, and it was the gold standard. In the 19th century, prices were no higher in the UK at the end of the century than they were 40 or 50 or 60 years earlier. A sovereign had more purchasing power at the end of that period than they did at the beginning of that period.
And yet, do you know how many asset bubbles we had? Sorry, Tim, I'm interrupting you. Finish, please.
No, so far away.
Well, you mentioned the 19th century, but there's no shortage of bank runs and financial crises in the 19th century. There's loads of them.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that that's the way the Schumpeterian creative destruction. So let bad businesses fail. The capital will be replaced by good businesses, good capital, and good entrepreneurs. The problem we've got now is that no big bank is ever allowed to fail, and we're building up to, I think, what is, and we may see it as early as this year, the mother of all bubbles exploding, because it's a bubble in credit.
Yeah, it's also a bubble in credit that hasn't been well allocated. because we have most of that new credit has gone to asset buyers, and you only have to look at house prices in Britain or the US to understand that problem. And we've reached a point where I personally think that high house prices have become an existential threat to our societies
I think I agree
because
with you there because I was listening to, sorry, again, sorry to interrupt
yeah,
your train of thought. I was listening to an interview earlier with, I think it was Michael Green, done in December, and he was making the point that everything is so expensive now for like Gen Z and for millennials. There's no way they can get on the housing ladder. There's no way they can save conventionally, which is why Gen Z, I use the word investors loosely, but Gen Z investors are basically buying lottery tickets in the form of crypto. It's the
yeah,
only way they have stand a remote chance of making any money.
yeah. Also, a lot of them are still living at home with their parents. Now, this was something I just discussed the other day. One third, it's 33.7% of 20 to 34-year-olds in the UK in 2024 are still living at home with their parents. Sorry, of young men specifically. It's lower for women. There's actually 22% of young women aged 20 to 34 are living at home, and 33.7% of young men are living at home still. Now, look, in our generation or our parents' generation, by the time you were 34, you owned a home. You were maybe onto your second house at that point. You had kids. Those kids were in school. You had a wife. You had a life. The average age of a home buyer is now 34, which again just shows that forming a new household and building a family is almost an unattainable goal for lots and lots of young people today. Many of those young men are stuck at home, getting high, playing computer games, and living off the bank of mum and dad. Some, admittedly, are living at home for longer so that they can save up for that first property. But either way you look at it, if we have a significant proportion of our young people checking out of the economic system and of the ability to form new households. And the birth rate in the UK is now down to 1.4 women per children. That's an absolute population collapse because the replacement rate's 2.1. So if we're down to 1.4, that means that literally the next generation will be two-thirds the size of this generation. And the next generation after that will be two-thirds the size of that one. And that's a really rapid decline.
The
Unless
whole,
we replace them with unwanted migrants.
Unless we replace them with migrants. But all the migrants that we're letting in are
Unproductive
unskilled,
economically.
unproductive. Yeah, they're either minimum wage workers or we have a large number of people that are just moving into the country and going straight on to benefits and staying there. So that's not sustainable either. We have to change what we're doing fundamentally. And I argue that it all comes back to our monetary system. It all comes back to money, credit, and banking, which are the three things that mainstream economics studiously avoids discussing.
so if we put you in charge right now and you could do whatever you want, what would you do?
Three policies, the first of which is credit guidance, because under the system that we have right now, credit is the fuel of the economy, and you've got to pump that fuel to the engine of the economy, which is small and medium-sized enterprises. The trouble is that the likes of, your Citibanks and your Barclays aren't interested in lending to your window cleaners and your bricklayers. So that brings me to policy number two, which would be a complete rewrite of our banking regulation so that, yes, on the one hand, we want to protect consumers, but on the other hand, we've got to enable and incentivize people to start up new banks, new credit unions, new building societies. So we get this huge, healthy cardiovascular system of a financial system with, large, small, and medium-sized banks. Let me give you one little example, right? You can set up a credit union in the UK, and a credit union can lend to businesses, but the regulations limit that to £15,000, which it's irrelevant. Like
Yeah.
it just means that credit unions are not viable in the UK. And then policy number three is the more interesting one. I think we have to somehow decouple economic growth from the never-ending growth in debt. And so that means that we have to have new money coming into the monetary system from somewhere. And there's a policy which has been around for a long, long time. It's an idea called sovereign money, or also known as full reserve banking, in which you basically tell the banks, okay, you guys, you've enjoyed your exorbitant privilege for a long time of being able to create money out of thin air and charging us to use it. Now you're going to have to just lend money that you first took in deposits. Okay, so we need an injection of new money. If we want the economy to go at 3%, we need the money supply to grow at 3%. Well, where does that come from? Well, that comes from the central bank, which can create that as new money, give it to the government to spend. So then suddenly we're not worried about government deficits anymore. And then the government can get to spend that 3% into the economy every year without worrying about having to go to the financial markets and without being at the mercy of the bond vigilantes. So I think sovereign money would then enable you to start injecting debt-free money into the economy year on year, so that bit by bit, the amount of money in the economy that is linked to debt shrinks, and the amount of money in the economy that is debt-free expands. That's probably the most controversial of the three ideas.
So if, as we probably suspect, things will continue in the vein that they are at the moment in the UK, what do you think will happen? What will be the effects?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I think we are heading for probably a repetition of one of the crises that we've had in the past. We have a huge amount of debt. We have now suddenly inflationary forces in the economy, which seem a little untamable, despite the fact that official inflation figures are coming down. I don't know anybody that doesn't feel considerably poorer than they did 5 years ago.
Oh, they're lying about the inflation rate.
And I think they always have. So what happens next? I don't know, because the trouble is that if we all collectively pay down our debts, we shrink the money supply and we tip the economy immediately into a recession.
But it's not our debts we're talking about. It's specifically government debts, and they're never going to get repaid.
Yeah. And they're not. But the only way the government can repay the debts is it has to run a surplus. Now, the government running a surplus means it taxes more from us than it spends back into the private sector. Well, if the government is continuously taking more money out of the private sector than it spends back into it, then the private sector is, by definition, getting worse and worse and worse off. Let me give you an analogy on this one, right? If everyone's heard the aphorism that, John goes to the grocer's shop and he spends 20 quid on groceries, and then the grocer goes to the garage and he fills up his car and he spends that 20 quid on petrol, and then the garage owner goes to the butcher and he spends that 20 quid on meat, and so on and so on. And so that one £20 note goes round the economy, and it performs multiple transactions, and everyone ends up better off. Okay, example number 2. John goes to the grocer and spends 20 quid on groceries, and the grocer goes to the bank and says, here, let me put this 20 quid towards repaying my overdraft. That 20 quid now disappears back into the ether from whence it came. And so the garage owner and the butcher and everybody else in that chain of transactions no longer get to benefit from it.
But wouldn't that also mean that he would have less interest to pay on his debt, and then he could use that money for something more productive?
Well, the interest on 20 quid is going to be a lot less than the 20 quid.
Well, I'm assuming that we're talking in small numbers here, just for example, but if we're talking about large amounts, then it magnifies.
The other thing to remember is that interest doesn't disappear. So if I borrow £1,000 from Barclays, right, they create that £1,000 out of thin air. I then in total pay back Barclays the £1,000 plus interest. Let's call it 1,100 quid just for argument's sake. Well, so the £1,000 disappears back into the ether, but the 100 quid in interest that I've paid to Barclays doesn't. Barclays uses that money to pay for its expenses. So it might go on salaries, or it might go on, rent of an office or purchase of computers or so on. So that interest flows back into the economy via Barclays' spending. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the magic of being able to print money that most people don't realize that the banks have got this ability, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean,
Yeah, it's an absolutely exorbitant privilege.
yeah,
And let me reframe that as well. Given that we all need money to be able to set up businesses and create goods and services and to be able to trade with each other, right? All of the money that we have in our economy, and we know this courtesy of the Bank of England, which published a paper in 2014 in which they explained that banks create money when they lend, and that 97% of money in existence in the UK was created by commercial banks. Okay, so banks basically create all the money, and we have to pay interest on all the money. So banks are effectively taxing every single economic transaction that goes on in our economy. Every bit of GDP that goes on in our economy, because it's all backed by debt and we pay interest on that debt, the banks are taxing the entire economy. But it doesn't just stop there, because the biggest thing that we buy in our lives is our house. And we all have to have a mortgage to buy our house. And the biggest stock of wealth in the country is the housing stock. And so we all have to borrow money to buy a house, which means that the banks also then get to effectively tax the entire wealth of the country as well. So banks really have this exorbitant privilege. And it's not surprising that they are one of the most powerful lobbying groups in the world.
Well, it makes you wonder how on earth they can possibly ever lose money.
You do have to wonder, don't you? I mean, how do you ever have a banking crisis when they literally get to tax the entire income and wealth of the nation? But they do. It's astonishing.
but that's concentration of lending, isn't it? Where all the money goes into the housing market, into the land market, because that's where the biggest returns come from, which then, even though they know that this ends with a crisis, they just still do it because the numbers look good in the first, in each quarter, and they're being paid to do it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon because, it's a little bit like the way PLCs are run, right? If it was your own business, you wouldn't make some of those decisions. And I think this would be an interesting subject to study, actually. How you go from having a collection of very rational, intelligent people, but you put them together into an organization, and suddenly these organizations behave in completely irrational ways.
It is the competition that does it. And I think what was really interesting and in the global financial crisis was you saw this happening in real time. The pressure for Lloyds, for example, not to be lending aggressively into the housing market and in the same way that all the other banks were doing was absolutely phenomenal. In fact, I was quite surprised that they didn't succumb to that pressure well before. But then it was only, ironically, after the crisis where they'd done the right thing that they got forced to buy HBOS, which had terrible debt and had done the wrong thing. It was just you couldn't make it up. It was just incredible.
No, and the crazy thing is, I'm guessing you guys will be familiar with the 18.6 year real estate cycle.
Yes.
Yeah. So we do this every 18 years. Like that's not even that long.
No.
I mean, I can remember 18 years ago and I can remember 18 years before that. And yet somehow collectively as a society, we keep making the exact same mistake every 18 years. It's bizarre.
It's because human nature doesn't change, or if it does change, it changes so slowly that it effectively amounts to no change in a course of a lifetime or several lifetimes.
Yeah, we have to mention Phil Anderson and Akhil Patel, who drew our attention to the 18.6 year cycle of property share market economics, because I mean, it's just what is phenomenal about all of this is bringing your attention to it. And actually just there are people out there who truly understand what's going on and have answers to all these questions.
I don't think they work for the banks.
No, that's the whole thing. It's as Karim is saying that how it's an interesting study to see why do they get corrupted. The Japanese go to America, which manage their economy more poorly than the Japanese, and now they're taking their model. I mean, it's almost as though if one had a suspicious mind, you'd say that this is all happening on purpose. So eventually maybe America can come in and start controlling the world. I mean, it sounds crazy, but why else would you allow your economy to do this, especially when you know what the answers to it are quite simple. How can you have not worked out? So, for example, we had Andrew Craig on, who was saying that exactly what you've been saying, Karim, about that there are companies out there. We all know that the best technology has come from all these research houses in Cambridge and Oxford, these brilliant ideas, and they would change the world. But instead of raising money in the UK, it gets raised in America. Now, I always thought that was a cultural thing. It was just that Americans are open for business and they do want to hear your ideas, where maybe here we have less of an open door and that sort of thing. We're always looking at the negative side and how it won't work, where they're looking at how it will work. But it seems like this is more of a fundamental problem about how our actual system works. And therefore, government should be able to, step in and fix the problem. Somebody should be, if we can sit around a table and say, our businesses are not being supported, what can we do? And we're looking at
government can't fix the problem because government, by and large, is the problem.
Well, they have the power to fix the problem.
Sorry, Tim, if you make that an axiomatic assumption, then absolutely the problem will never get fixed. But if you look at China in 1979, all it took was for Deng Xiaoping to go to Japan, ask the Japanese what the secret of their success was, and then go back to China and implement that policy. And look at what's happened to China in the last 40 years. So I think we have to stay away from this sort of falling into this trap of thinking, well, look, our government is, our political system is pretty terrible. It consistently delivers as terrible politicians and they consistently muck stuff up. Therefore, government per se is the problem. If it wasn't for government, we'd all still be breathing pea soupers. We'd have crap on our beaches and rivers that you couldn't swim in because they're so polluted with chemicals. So I think there are issues that only government can solve. And one of them is externalities. And one of the most obvious externalities is pollution. Okay, that's a negative externality. But you have positive externalities as well, for instance. So now, thanks to government, we have kids that can go to school and learn to read and write rather than working in a coal mine at the age of 8. So again, that was a problem that only government could fix.
I'm not advocating for no government. I'm not an anarchist in that sense, but I am an advocate for government being as small as it can possibly be.
Well, yeah, but the question is, how small is that? And
well, Switzerland manages pretty well. Their economy does better than we do, and they've got a tiny government. No one's ever heard of any of them.
I mean, Swiss are also very happy with their political system because they have quite a significant degree of direct democracy, and I'd love to emulate that.
The right idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Swiss do have the right idea, and I'd love to emulate that. But in terms of, how do we fix Britain? I don't know, because the political system has become this juggernaut that won't turn, and so there's a whole discussion to be had about the relationship between the elected politicians and the civil service.
I would start by saying that the biggest problem is probably money and lobby groups. That you get the money out of politics, and no one's going to vote. No turkey's going to vote for Christmas. So good luck getting that through.
But is America doing it right? Why are they managing to capitalize on British ideas effectively? And
okay,
we can't.
Good question. And this is again one of the things I talk about in the book. Is the features of the German and the American economies that have made that explain their historical success, which isn't this policy of credit guidance. They've never had that. But what they do have is in America before the Wall Street crash of 1929, America had 25,000 different banks. After the Wall Street crash, and in the years that followed, something like 8,000 of them disappeared. And it's been shrinking ever since. But even today, America still has 8,000 or 9,000 different banks. And so you have this diversity and decentralization in their banking system, where if you are an entrepreneur in Ohio or Nebraska or anywhere, you've got options to get finance to start up a business. And and if you're successful, it'll become a big business, and you'll end up dealing with bigger banks. But they have this diversified and decentralized banking system, and it's the same in Germany, which benefits from this network of about 1,500 different small regional local banks and credit unions. And again, the German economy is quite similar to the UK economy in that 70% of workers in Germany are employed by SMEs. We tend to think of Germany in terms of their industrial giants like, Audi and BMW and Mercedes. But SMEs account for 70% of their economy. And those SMEs have been served by a diversified and decentralized banking system, which we don't have in the UK. We're going so much in the opposite direction that where I live in West Wales, if I want to go to a bank branch, I probably have to drive an hour to Swansea because they've closed down all the branches in the smaller towns. We are totally going in the wrong direction in the UK. We really have to change that.
I did wonder why the banks themselves are closing down their branches when the model for them to make even more money would be to buy up those properties.
Everything's going online. You fill out the form online. It all gets dealt with at the head office. Computer says yes or computer says no.
Yes, but for example, McDonald's is not a business that sells fast food. It's the main business is real estate. That's what people don't realize. It's just they are buying property, and the more they get, all the branches are in, and all the outlets are in prime locations. If you just bought those properties and sat on them, you'd make money over the long term.
You do need the physical property to deliver the physical good, whereas in banking there is no physical good because money's gone digital.
Yeah, no, that's true. But if you look at the rates at which the property market has gone up for all the reasons that you've very eloquently outlined, Karim, that trajectory will probably make more money. It makes more money. It does actually make more. McDonald's is a real estate business. If you just think of it like that.
But that's money on your balance sheet, not on your P&L.
But still, it's anyway. I understand the reasons for it. I used to work in branch banking, and I was at the first phase of seeing how things went from. A lot of stuff was done in-house in a branch. So, for example, if you wanted to take out a mortgage, I would look at the paperwork, and I'd be in charge of taking a legal charge over your property and all that sort of stuff. And then they decided to put it all in a central department. So it all got specialized in specialist areas. But the problem with that is that your local customer, whereas now for the actual end user, it's just got worse and worse because if you ring the bank, if you go to your local branch, you can have a chat about your local business, and he might have known you for a long time and say, well, I can make a judgment on Karim. He's a trustworthy guy, and he wants to, open up a new business. I can say that the risk of that is going to be pretty good because I've known him for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. But at a central office, they don't know anything about you. Not
well, that risk officer is going to be an AI now. It's not going to be a real person.
Well, exactly. Well, and that's a new development. What they will say is exactly the problem that has been outlined here. That they'll just say, "I don't want to do it. I'm not lending to something I don't understand," and they don't have the knowledge, the local knowledge, to assess that risk. So it all just goes into one place. So. If they wanted to
that's exactly right, Paul, as well. That's exactly right. That's why you have to have the decentralized banking system. You have to have local branch managers who know their customers making those decisions. And so that's part of the success of China and on the one hand and Germany and America on the other hand.
So you've only just written this book, Realonomics. At what point did you have the aha moment? I've got to write this book. I've got to get this out. I've seen the answers, and what are the next steps for you on this journey?
Well, I started writing the book. I had no intention of ever writing a book. I never thought I'd be able to, because I didn't think I had that much to say. But after seeing that Richard Werner interview back in 2016, I just started devouring everything he'd ever written. I came across Steve Keen and I read everything he'd ever written. And, this just led to me relearning economics from scratch.
Who's Steve Keen? I've not heard of him.
Oh, he's worth listening to. So he's really worth listening to. I'll ping you over a link to one of his videos.
Oh, brilliant.
He has a very similar approach to economics as I do. and he's developed a piece of software called Ravel, in which he uses double entry bookkeeping to model the economy. And it's what he's done is effectively develop a computer model that models what I talk about in the book. So I've done it in descriptive terms. Steve Keen is a proper academic. He's done it in academic and mathematical and computer modeling terms. But yeah, really worth listening to. And he, when he plugs some numbers into his Ravel model, you see the impact of making different assumptions, whether you assume that banks can only lend deposits as per mainstream economics, or you change the assumption and make banks creators of money. And you see what that does to GDP in his model. It's really fascinating watching that. So he's definitely worth paying some attention to. His book, Debunking Economics, I have a chapter titled Debunking Economics. So I'll give credit to Steve Keen. He helped me crystallize a lot of my doubts about what I learned at university. But where was I going with that? Yeah, so basically I was assembling all of this information and all of these ideas, and I was scribbling notes on bits of paper, and I just thought, I've got to get this in order in my head somehow. So I started writing, just putting it down chapter by chapter, and suddenly it turned into a book. And I thought, well, oh hell, I've written a book. Okay, I'll see if I can send it off to a publisher and see if they like it. And luckily, I chose a good publisher, and the first people I sent the book to, they liked it and signed it.
Have you had any response from government on this? Has anyone approached you?
Rachel's not answering my calls. I have tried.
I think she'd be worried you'll take a job.
I did write a couple of times to number 11 and say, hey, you don't have to tax the economy to death. There are alternatives. But like I said, Rachel,
you're on a list now.
Calls. Probably. And we run up against this problem that there is an entrenched system, and all of the officials that are advising Rachel from accounts, all of those Treasury officials have all been taught economics at university the same way as I was. They've all learnt the same terrible ideas that I was taught, and they think they know best. I contacted my old university, and they said, oh, congratulations on your book. It's great to hear you've still got a passion for your subject. I said, would you like to read a copy? And they went, no, thanks.
What?
We don't have anyone teaching heterodox economics, was their response.
Wow. It's
not interested.
Oh, the closed-mindedness of this, it just baffles me. It really does. What can we do to get more people? I mean, obviously, we're trying to do this with the podcast, so more people get to hear about these ideas, and it's not so much that it's absolutely crucial that this gets out, because we're heading towards another crisis. I wonder whether the next crisis will have people listen to ideas like this, new ideas. We need some fresh thinking. I mean, I'm going back to passionately, I agreed with Tim about the GFC. I didn't think the bank should be bailed out. I have to admit, I'm slightly changing my view on that now, because I see that if they'd actually gone in and done that, it would have been devastating. But what Tim's
it would have been a much shorter period of crisis, though.
Well,
because the economy would have restructured itself. Whenever you interfere, there are always consequences to the interference.
Possibly,
I agree with that.
But what I was going to say was, and then we can throw it out, was that what we need is to see the problem and to correct these problems as has been identified by Karim. So what you do is you bring the economy back onto its feet, and then you start taking away the power that's caused the problem in the first place. I think that would be a better way to manage it. If they're going to listen in the future, that might be how they bring these policies into effect. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation where we're going to need bailouts, and we're going to be under more control.
It'll be worse because it'll be bail-ins this time.
Well, I'm talking about,
that may well be where we're heading, Tim. And I'm guessing you guys will have probably heard of David Rogers
The Great
Webb and
Taking.
The Great Taking. Yeah, I mean that's a really frightening prospect, I think, and the vast majority of people have no idea about it. But I want to respond to something that Tim just said, which is that we should have let the banks go bust. And I'd say, in a different world, that's what we should do. In a world where we have a huge diversity of banks, where we have a really well-populated banking system, then yes, we could afford to let a few of them go bust. In this world where we have the UK economy dominated by the big four, big five, we can't, because that will literally take down the rest of the economy with it. So I think we have to do the banking reform first, and then ensure we need a competition commission that really views banking differently from other businesses. Because I think the competition commission tend to look at everything from the point of view of, will this merger drive up prices for consumers? And if we don't think it will, then we'll let it go ahead. But in the banking system, they have to ask a different question. They have to ask, will this merger result in a financial institution that's so big that if it goes bust, this will have a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy? And so your bar becomes much, much lower. And I would argue, you need a bank that's probably less than 1% of the credit market, of the lending market. Otherwise, its collapse does affect loads and loads of businesses, because if you're a small family manufacturing firm, let's say, right, and you rely on your local bank for credit for your to keep your working stock topped up and your staff paid, and your bank goes bust, well, potentially that drags you down with it, unless you can rapidly secure finance from somewhere else. So banks are different in nature from other businesses. I think it's risky to say, well, we should have just let them go bust. But certainly in this world where we've got such concentration in the banking industry, we can't afford for that to happen yet. And
I think the banks are going to bring their fate upon themselves, because they offer a shit service. Everybody hates them. There's no real competition. It's a massive monopoly, and they're being replaced as we speak by new technology. So I think there's a phrase I came across 20 odd years ago, which is, and it's attributed in some quarters to Bill Gates of all people, but it's, banking is necessary, but banks aren't. And that's never been more the case than it is now.
So, yeah, but you have to have something to replace it with. And
new banks, smaller banks, different forms of credit.
But the regulation in order to open a bank should be the regulation that should be there to actually merge a bank. You should have that amount of regulation before you actually merge a bank, as opposed to opening a bank. That would be that's where it's gone wrong. How can you have enough paperwork to get to the height of Nelson's column in order to set up a bank, but they haven't thought of the most simplest thing that Karim's just said here, that what happens if this bank goes down? And the Monopolies and Mergers Commission haven't even thought about that. They just let it go ahead. If you look at the bank names, you go back in history, you see how all these names got amalgamated. And even just sort of 20 years ago, there were so many more banks, individual banks, investment banks. And because they're so profitable, they just eat each other, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they've only just stopped here because it's so obvious that there's so few banks that it's almost just too much. But still, if one bank goes out of five, you've got a huge financial problem. Everyone's going to go down because they're all exposed to exactly the same problems, and it's incredible that they haven't thought of that they're all lending in exactly the same way, in exactly the same aggressive way. I wondered at the end of the crisis, I was trying to think of a way that would kind of counterbalance it in the banking system, whereby you could have a bank account that you'd have a bank that would only lend money in a very prudent way. You could open that bank after a year. You couldn't just suddenly move your money there, and all the deposit of that bank is safe. The idea of that would be, in order to keep the other banks honest in what they're doing, so that they would attract this individual bank would attract capital towards it, making the other banks less risky in their approach. Now, it's I think there's a simpler problem. Sorry, I think there's a simpler solution now, having heard Karim's ideas, that if you just have lots of them, then you're spreading the risk in the same way you spread your risk across, maybe different products in order to reduce the risk of trading, for example. But unfortunately, we all know where we're headed with this. And I just wondered, with regard to competition, from what Tim's just said here, do you see any role for cryptocurrencies to be a competitor towards the banking system, given that it's a payment system, like Bitcoin's a payment system, as well as a new inverted commas currency?
I mean, I wish, and I know some very intelligent people have been trumpeting the benefit of cryptocurrencies for years. I just don't see it. I mean, out of the three of us, who bought anything using Bitcoin in the last year?
No, where's Dominic Frisby when you need him? Yeah.
But I mean, the only reason you buy a Bitcoin is because you're hoping to sell it to somebody else for a higher price at a later date. Well, that's the definition of a Ponzi scheme. So I know I would get shouted at by a lot of cryptocurrency advocates, but I just don't see it, because I don't see a use case other than selling it to somebody else at a higher price. Nobody's actually using it to buy anything.
Well, that's the thing, Karim. If you have if it was just a individual currency, inverted commas, where you could just buy and sell it on its own, then perhaps you're looking at more of a Ponzi scheme. The reason why I think it's more serious than that is because within the Bitcoin system, it's a payment system. So it's a payment system that can live outside of the bank. So if you're trading any other product, from commodities to anything else, it's a product on its own. Even money itself is not a system. You need the banks in order to transmit that money. But with Bitcoin, it is a payment system. If the whole banking system goes down, Bitcoin still exists. That's the advantage of it. Now, I think,
but don't you still need the exchanges, and you still need the infrastructure to access the network. So for me to be able to send Bitcoin to you,
yeah,
I would have to log on to an exchange, put my cryptocurrency on the exchange, and then transfer it to your wallet, right?
Well,
so
when you say exchange, all it is a series of computers that are all online because they are paid to do that. And it's a bit like sending an email. Of course you need a computer to do it. And if there is,
and I need a server and an email service, and that server can be shut down.
Not easily, not very easily. It's very, very hard to. That's the whole point. It's no one controls it. No one can control it. No individual can interfere with it. That's the advantage of it. So
I think my issue with it is, though, it's still quite a tricky process. It's not as simple as going into a shop and slapping your card down on the card reader. It's relatively complicated. You've got to go online, you've got to create a wallet, and then you've got to decide whether it's a hardware wallet or one you keep on your desktop. Or all of those decisions you have to make, and all of those processes you have to go through before I can actually send you some money. Whereas I can open my banking app and I can send you 100 quid from my account to your account instantly. And so I think until a cryptocurrency is as easy to use as a regular currency, it doesn't have much of a use case. And I get that with things like Ethereum, they're a platform for smart contracts, and I get that there's value in that. But purely as a form of money, which Bitcoin is supposed to be, it doesn't have the smart contract side of it. So it's supposed to be just purely a form of money, but it's not. It's just a speculative asset. Nobody is sending money to each other via Bitcoin unless they are trying to avoid the Chinese government or buying drugs on the the dark web or something. Like, otherwise, nobody's using Bitcoin as money.
I hear your arguments there, but they said that about the internet when it first came online. It was all just sort of, stealing IP and pornography and what have you, and it was just the Wild West, and they were trying to shut that down, and then then somebody decided that they wanted to try and buy the internet because a big corporation could see the value in it and realize that they couldn't. No one can.
Okay, but how many years was it from internet first being available to us to it being actually something that people could see the value in?
It only took a few years because
It's
95,
only a few
96
years, right?
was when it was launched with Netscape, and within a few years, everyone was there and using it.
Well,
and all these listed companies. I mean, by the year 2000, there were dozens and dozens of listed companies. Okay, most of them went pop in the dot-com bubble, but that launched a lot of really big viable businesses. Well, Bitcoin's been around for well over a decade now, and I still don't see a use case for it.
But that doesn't mean that there isn't a use case for it. It just means you're absolutely right. It is difficult. And by the way, I'm only defending it because I can see the other side of it. But will it go to zero? Maybe. I'm not saying that there isn't a huge risk in investing it. But you could have also said that about Amazon right at the beginning. Yeah, it could be, but they're burning so much money. Will this really work? Will people really buy stuff online? Can they make it work? Maybe they can't. But yes, you're absolutely right. You've got to be a bit of a geek to be able to use Bitcoin, and it is risky. If you send money to the wrong place, then you're never going to get it back, and you can be hacked. And well, I say you can be hacked. You can accidentally give away something that you shouldn't, and then your account can be hacked. Or if you forget your password or whatever it is, then you have no access to the money at all. There's all sorts of horrible problems with it.
Or if you throw out your hard drive and then spend the next 10 years rummaging through a council site.
Exactly.
Did you guys see that story?
Yeah, oh yeah. He's still trying to get that money. He's still trying to, that's the story of a guy. I think he's in Wales, isn't he? There's I think
might well be. Yeah. Might well be.
Anyway, but if you look at, if you want to have a look at a chart of anything, have a look at a chart of Monero, because Monero, see, the thing with Bitcoin is it's a pseudo-anonymous system whereby if I know that your account number is 123, I might not know it's Karim's account number, but I can follow every single transaction that you've made. And if I then connect you, then I know what you've been doing. But there's a cryptocurrency called Monero, where not only is the blockchain completely dark, all the transactions are as well. It's just gone through the roof. It's gone absolutely through the roof. And it's almost like people are trying to take their money out of the system somehow. And they want to put it in inverted commas, the safest place. I'm not saying that's the safest place. I'm just saying that we are looking at stress, and you can see that right now with gold and silver and precious metals doing what they're doing.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, right? I'm not a hater. I wish that we had an alternative. I hope that we have a way of getting outside of our existing financial system. But until I can go to Marks and Spencer's and buy a pair of boxer shorts with Bitcoin or whatever, Monero or whatever the cryptocurrency might be, I just don't see that it's viable yet to call it money. It's something else at the moment. It exists. And the Bitcoin is clearly well, some people would call it a speculative asset. Some people would call it an investment asset. Whether you're warm or cold on Bitcoin, you can't call it money because you can't spend it.
Well, there are ways to do that. There's something called the Lightning Network that makes it easier. And personally, I haven't done it. And I completely understand why people don't do it. And I totally agree. This needs to be accessible to the general public. Your mum should be able to use it, or, somebody who's non-techie should be able to use it in a very simple way. If they solve that problem, then the use case goes through the roof. But I think at this stage, the reason why it's endured in the way it has is because it is a genuinely groundbreaking technology. And I think that's the thing that I kind of missed at the beginning, because I just thought, well, okay, this can be easily replicable, and therefore, why not just make loads of coins, which is exactly what's happening in the altcoin market. There's and it's all very, very, very speculative, and there's too much money flowing into it. And we talked about Gen Z and what they're up to. They're just trying to get rich quickly. So that's not good. That's not good at all, of course.
Yeah, I think you'd have to agree with me that the altcoin market that has all the characteristics of a Ponzi scheme.
Well, yes. Again, it's like there are some good projects, some genuinely good projects, like any business. Like during the dot-com boom, there were some genuinely good projects, but most of them were, let's just stick .com at the end of our name and make a load of money. And then run off,
true.
So you have to look at everything on a case by case basis. But yes, certainly finding the good projects compared to the ones that are trying to.
While we're talking about money, I want to go back to something. Oh, sorry, I think I lost the audio for a second there, guys. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we
fine.
can. Yeah, there might have been a buffering going on. Yeah.
Okay, great. So on this subject of money, I want to go back to something Tim said a little while ago, because Tim is an advocate of sound money. And what do you mean by sound money, Tim?
A form of money that's not issued by the state and is not subject to counterparty risk in the same way, that's not subject to inevitable inflation risk, something that's a store of value over time, which is gold, for example.
Yeah. So for instance, a currency that was backed to a fixed percentage by physical gold, would that satisfy the definition for you?
Quite possibly.
Okay. So given that globally the rate at which we can dig gold out of the ground and purify it and stick it back in vaults under the ground, we can increase the gold supply at about 1.6% per annum at the moment. Eventually those gold stocks run out and that goes to zero. But at the moment we can grow the gold supply by 1.6% per annum. So if we back our money to a fixed percentage by gold, then that means our money supply can only grow at 1.6% per annum, doesn't it?
I don't necessarily dispute the logic, but the thing is that 1 to 1.5% of which gold supply has risen over the last 25 years has happened during a time when the gold price has now reached a record. So it may not even be that high in the future.
Okay, so yeah, you can. So the value of your gold reserves can go up simply by increasing the value of gold. But if you're fixing your currency against gold, then in order to have a growing money supply, you have to have a growing gold reserve, correct?
Well, it's often said that there isn't enough gold in the world to satisfy a gold-backed monetary system, but the difference is the price. An ounce of gold would be sufficient to capitalize the entire world, but don't ask what the price is going to be, because I don't think people are going to like the answer.
Okay, but at some point, if you adopt that system, you have to fix the gold price, don't you?
I don't know. Don't see why. I mean, the whole point about gold as a store of value and as a money is the one form of true money that JP Morgan himself acknowledged is that it's nobody's liability.
Yeah.
And no one's ever been coerced into using it. Its use has always arisen spontaneously in a free market environment.
But if you allow if you're tying your currency to the value of gold, but then you're going to allow the value of gold to increase over time with respect to your currency, then that's currency debasement, isn't it? If you're allowing the value of gold to go up relative to the fiat currency that's backed by it, then the value of your fiat currency is still going down.
All fiat currency will always trade at a discount to gold because fiat currency is worthless. The only reason people used gold is because fiat, in the words of Voltaire, all fiat currency ultimately returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero.
Yeah,
it's the gold that's the money. The fiat's just paper.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is if you've got a currency backed by gold, and so when we've had gold-backed currencies in the past, it's been, $1 is worth, 1 ounce of gold is worth however many dollars, and it's fixed at that value. And so the only way you can increase your money supply then is to dig gold out of the ground and purify it and put it in a vault. But if the global gold supply can only increase at 1.6% per annum, then that means the global money supply can only grow at 1.6% per annum.
Well, that's with 100% gold backing.
Or even at 25% gold backing.
I think what's going on.
I think you can multiply it up. Yeah.
I think what's going on here is what Tim's possibly looking at the lens of gold as being money, whereas you're looking at the problem of how do you increase your money supply? Because that's what a growing economy needs. So,
Well, the whole point is you
Exactly,
can't
yeah.
grow your money supply. That's the entire point of the exercise.
but the
Well,
the
then you
problem with that is that then your economy then will be in trouble potentially because other countries will grow their money supply and be more prosperous, and you'll lag behind
not
potentially.
even that, not even that, Paul. If you can't grow your money supply, you can't grow your economy. Period.
But I think if Tim, obviously you're going to answer for yourself, but I'm thinking in your world you don't care about that because the money is what you're interested in, and you don't want it debased. So it's almost looking at a use case for why do you invest in gold? You invest in gold because it can't be debased. Money can be debased. It will be debased by governments, but it's a good intellectual exercise to think, well, if we were to go 1-to-1 on a gold standard, would it be better? It would certainly make governments more honest, but not with the banking system that we've got at the moment.
Well, the banks would never vote for it, but the 19th century was a perfect example of an economy where you had basically there was no requirement to grow the money supply because the money had value, and there was effectively we had zero inflation for about 60 or 70 years. The only requirement to grow the money supply is in a debt-based monetary system.
Well, you have to grow the money supply if you want economic growth. So in the book, I talk a lot about the quantity theory of money, and in the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, right? V is a constant. Sorry to anyone that's listening to this. It'll sound a little bit wonkish, but V is a constant, and you want P prices to be a constant, which means that if you want if you want Y, which is GDP, to grow by at 3 or 4 or 5% per year, then M, the money supply, has to grow at exactly the same rate. And so my concern about the proposals for sound money that I've seen is that because you're restricting the growth of the money supply, then by definition you're restricting growth of the economy.
In what respect is Bitcoin different? Because the supply of Bitcoin's finite.
Yeah, and it won't work as money for that exact reason.
I don't think it'll work as money
Karim's
either.
I don't
So
think Karim's arguing that it will be. And I think it's just a total outsider that was designed to try and keep or to create something similar to gold, but would also be a payment system. But it isn't necessarily going to do that because it's got a limited supply. You're going to run into the same problems of you not being able to grow it as the economy needs it. But during that period that you mentioned, Tim, where there was a gold-backed economy, was there growth as well?
the entire growth of the United States came about during that period. I'd need to check the history books for the precise data, but I think probably the most prosperous period in American and British history was in a period before the Fed was even established, which was 1913. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't bank failures, but there were always bank failures. But the point that that Karim's advocating, which I entirely agree with, is that 1,000 flowers bloom.
Well, there were bank failures, but there were lots of banks, so
exactly. So they kind of cancelled each other out.
Yeah,
and there was also a lot of gold being dug out of the ground at the time.
So you're saying so the growth of money actually effectively is what you're saying was growing much faster than the 1.6% that it would be today.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any numbers on the amount of gold that was extracted in the 19th century, but my guess is that they were expanding the money supply. When gold was money, they were expanding that money supply rapidly.
Obviously, you prefer for that not to be the case, because what did for the economy of Spain was the importation of gold from the Americas, which caused a hyperinflation in Europe.
I'm not going to argue the economic history on that one. Michael Hudson's really interesting. If you ever fancy a bit of economic history, he's a great guy to listen to. As I understand it, yes, the Spanish were acquiring lots of gold from their overseas colonies, but also spending it even faster.
But they simply expanded their money supply because of the gold, and as a result, the money became less valuable.
So let's put it
Yeah.
another way. If we were to go on a gold standard now against all the other nations in the world, what would happen? What would be the net effect if we could
All
have
right.
a
Well, if
thought
we did it
experiment?
unilaterally, our economy would collapse.
Right. So
I suspect.
I mean, I know,
Can
of
I-
course, we're talking theoretically, but it's as an end
Okay,
goal.
so different question. Why are all central banks seemingly buying and hoarding gold right now? And you can't say it's tradition because that's nonsense.
That's a good point.
Well, that's a whole different argument, because I
Well,
think
they're doing
in
it to
the
shore up
era,
confidence in fiat currency, which is worthless.
in an era where America can seize your reserves for its own geopolitical reasons, then it makes sense to have an alternative system.
For sure.
And
I think the historians of the future will look back at that decision to sanction Russia after the invasion of Ukraine as the most catastrophic self-inflicted geopolitical damage done by a country against itself in history.
yeah, well, it predates that even, because if you go back a few
The trend had been
years,
accelerating long before Russia-Ukraine, but it was
yeah,
like the icing on the cake.
yeah. I mean, if you
To say
remember,
to a nuclear power, by the way, you can't trust our assets anymore because we could just arbitrarily seize them on a whim. You can't trust our assets, or our liabilities, I should say, and you can't trust our currency either.
yeah.
Well, good luck with your 38 trillion national debt now, which is dependent on almost entirely on the kindness of foreign countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And before that even, I don't know if you guys recall, Britain decided to seize Venezuela's gold reserves, which were at the time stored in London by the Bank of England. And I wrote to my MP at the time saying, like, what are we doing? This is piracy. We might not like the Maduro government, but you can't just go seizing their gold. This will not bode well for us. And sure enough, within about a year, Poland and a couple of other countries announced that they were going to repatriate their gold from London. So it was, it was obvious what was going to happen, and it did. And we've completely undermined ourselves, and it was a terrible, terrible idea.
Well, the central banks undermined us, but that's what central banks do, which is why we don't need them.
Yeah, well, I mean, central banks do perform two very useful functions, one of which is enabling settlement of transactions between the different commercial banks, because they all have an account with the central bank. And so when if I want to transfer some money to you, Tim, and I bank at Barclays and you bank at Lloyd's, right? Barclays aren't sending a taxi across town with 100 quid note, 100 quids within notes in it. Barclays just tell the Bank of England, please mark our account down by £100, and please mark Lloyd's bank account up by £100. And then Lloyd's tells you, Tim, we've received £100 on your behalf. So that settlement function is really valuable.
The settlement function can operate independently of the regulatory function and the support for banking function, though. They don't have to be all lumped together by the same entity.
Agreed. Yeah, totally correct. Then you've got the banking support function, which is the quantitative easing and all the other stuff that the central banks do, and I think you believe, it seems like you think they shouldn't do that, and I think during a crisis they should, but as soon as the crisis is over they should stop, and I think they've got a little bit money printing happy, and that's why we're seeing as much currency debasement as we are. But ironically, that currency debasement is in the form of soaring financial markets rather than consumer inflation. We didn't get consumer inflation until COVID.
Well, I'd beg to differ to the extent that, for me, I'd be with Friedman saying inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So if you increase the money supply, you increase inflation. The price of goods and services is a second-order impact.
It depends where the money flows to, because the economy is not one pool of liquidity.
No,
right?
but if you increase the money supply fundamentally, you ultimately increase prices and everything, because everything gets devalued in paper money terms.
Okay, but look at the QE that happened from 2009 to 2014. We had three big episodes of QE there. And each time that they injected money into the financial markets, the price of financial assets rose. But inflation in the real economy stayed absolutely flat. Didn't move a muscle, didn't move an inch.
But that's because central banks were creating money and commercial banks were destroying it through deflation, through paying down their balance sheets, or through consumers doing the same thing. So so in other words, it was the equivalent of someone had pulled the bath plug as the taps were still being turned to full. So the net effect was zero.
So I would argue what was going on was that if you disaggregate the financial markets from the rest of the economy, money flowed into the financial markets courtesy of QE. And because the price of assets at any moment in time is fixed, the price of those assets went up. And that's what we saw happen.
So that's the Cantillon effect we talked about earlier.
And yeah, I'm not disagreeing. And the Bank of England wrote a report sometime afterwards in which they said, yeah, the money that we injected into the financial system during the crisis, only about 5 to 10% of it at best flowed out into the rest of the economy. And so that's why prices didn't increase in the rest of the economy. They were shoveling money onto the banks' balance sheets, hoping that the banks would increase their lending to the rest of the economy.
And they didn't.
And they didn't know, because the thing that controls banks' decisions is their assessment of risk. It's not about how much reserves they've got sitting on their balance sheet. It's, will we get repaid? If I lend, £500,000 to Tim Price to buy this house that he's got his eye on, can Tim Price repay that loan? That's the decision they're making. That's all they care about. And so banks will lend to the rest of the economy, and they will increase their lending to the rest of the economy only when they're confident that they will be repaid, which obviously doesn't happen during recessions. Everyone loses confidence in a recession, and it's why they all follow they follow each other down the rabbit hole of subprime lending in the boom years, because again they just don't assess the risk correctly. But it's, the bank lending decisions are driven by their assessment of risk. So what the central bank's doing with their balance sheets is a completely different issue.
Okay. Have we got to the answer then, or any change of opinions? I guess not.
Well, I'm not sure we're necessarily fundamentally disagreeing. All I'm saying is money is far too important to be left to central banks and to politicians to dictate. It should be a function of the free market.
I would love to see an example of that working. I'm not sure how that works in a modern context.
What do the Swiss do?
I know this is an argument that gets made, and I just can't visualize how that works in a modern context.
But haven't we already seen it? It's called the 19th century.
Well, that's why I said modern context specifically.
But the reason it's modern is because we've had basically uniform central banking throughout the world since effectively the installation of the Fed in 1913.
Yeah.
The reason I'm so passionately against central banking is because the century of central banking was also the century of global war. And I don't think those factors are coincidental.
So let's look at it another way then. Tim, if we were to say that you were in charge and you could do whatever you want, what would you do then?
Resign instantly.
Retire to a desert island far, far away.
As good an answer as that is.
It's like, Ron Paul. So Ron Paul was asked, if you're going to get rid of the Fed, what would you replace it with? And he says, well, when you have cancer and you remove it, what do you replace it with?
Right. But okay. So what I'm saying is, what would be the steps that you would take? So you get rid of the central bank, then what?
How does the financial system work? How does it work in that scenario?
I mean, we've never, as you say, it's a modern thing. We've never had any experience of it. For the entirety of my life, we've never had sound money, or not since 71. So
I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong.
No one has any race memory of how a functioning system works, but I'm pretty sure it can work. And I'm pretty sure we don't need a technocrat. They had something in 1810, I think it was, called the Bank of England Bullion Committee. And basically what they said was, no man or group of men can possibly be intelligent enough to work out what the correct amount of circulating medium, I think they called it, should be. The point is, we have fallen prey to the idea that a group of people know better than the market how much money should be flowing in the economy. That is exactly the same mindset that says, you know what, let's have government directing everything. We'll have the state directing everything. That's what led to millions of people being murdered in Russia, millions of people being murdered or starved in China. Top-down technocracy does not work. And I find it absurd that the last vestige of top-down bureaucracy is alive and well, and it's in the central banking system of the world. How can that possibly make sense?
Well, just to
I
say,
think-
what about the most modern example of it actually not the gold-backed system working and without central bank, but an economy working? Wasn't that what you were talking about with Japan and how they were extremely prosperous? But it's not because. Is the problem not?
Japan's such an outlier because the reason Japan's fascinating is that when the property and stock market blew up in the late 80s, Japan experienced not one but two American Great Depressions in terms of the loss of wealth to the Japanese society. And yet we all remember all the rioting that took place in Tokyo. Well, no, we don't, because there wasn't any.
Yeah.
The Japanese are many things, but one of them is stoic. I don't think any other country in the West could possibly survive what Japan went through. So Japan's such an interesting outlier.
Well, the other thing is that Japan has benefited from low inflation, and so that their quality of life and cost of living has remained good.
So what's wrong with low inflation or deflation? If you're a normal member of the public, it's fantastic. The only people who don't like it are the fucking banks.
No, I agree. I'm all in favor of low deflation, and I think as an alternative to advocating for a financial system that we can't quite describe yet, based on not having a central bank, within the current system that we've got, we have a central bank whose target for inflation is 2% per annum.
And as I think you say in the book, it should be zero.
It should be zero. Absolutely, it should be zero. And the governor of the Bank of England should be hauled over the coals if it reaches 1. So I'm a big advocate for zero inflation, and I think we can have zero inflation, but we can't have it if our policy tool is interest rates, because interest rates do not control inflation. And I think I demonstrate that fairly convincingly in the book. Are you with me on that score, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a crude tool because it's the same as the absurdity of the Fed, which is tasked with full employment, stable inflation, and decent economic growth and long-term low interest rates. And they've got one policy tool, and it's called Fed funds. It's a joke. Well, of course, they've got more than that, but they shouldn't be allowed to mucky around with the bond market, which they do.
Yeah. Whereas if you adopt a policy of credit guidance and you want to tame consumer inflation, you just rein in consumer spending, or rein in consumer credit, which reins in consumer spending, which then takes all the heat out of inflation almost immediately. So I would argue that we should just tell our central bank, right, your new target for inflation is 0%.
And you'll lose your job if you don't achieve it.
You'll lose your job if you don't achieve it. And by the way, you've got this new tool called credit guidance. Use it liberally. And I think that takes care of the inflation problem. I also think then that takes care of the growth problem, because you then drive credit to where it's going to be most productive. It doesn't take care of the debt problem, because you still have growing debt over time. And that's why I think sovereign money is such an interesting idea. And
does sovereign money get rid of debt, though?
Yeah, if as I describe it in the book, you adopt a policy of injecting debt-free money into the economy. So the central bank creates money debt-free, gives it to the government spends it. So that solves your government debt problem immediately, because the government can run a deficit, but it's now spending debt-free money into the economy.
But it doesn't account for the existing debt problem, though.
No, but over time.
No, but I'm saying it's in terms of getting us from here to there.
Yeah,
you've still got the debt in the first instance, and I think what's going to happen is it's going to be inflated away, because that seems to be the only policy they've got left, which is going to lead to somebody, and it'll be pension funds and banks holding the wrong end of the stick.
Well, if credit guidance boosts our GDP growth up to, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5%, and the debt is no longer growing because we're now giving the government debt-free money to spend into the economy, then that debt, which is currently at about 100% of GDP, within a few years is considerably less than 100% of GDP and falling. So growth does actually erode the debt in that scenario.
In theory, but unfortunately, we've got a Labour government that's going to bankrupt the country before it goes.
Well, all of this is
every Labour administration, bar that of Tony Blair, has ended in a currency crisis. This one's going to be no different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sadly, all of this is hypothetical, Tim, because the government's never going to do it.
I know for sure. Well, again, the central bank won't vote for Christmas either. But I think someone should also spend some time working out who actually controls the central bank, because you may actually find that most of the world's central banks are not government agencies or independent entities, but private banking cartels themselves.
Exactly. And I think this is where we absolutely do agree, Tim, is that I have a slightly more positive view of the Bank of England than I do than you do, and I have a considerably more positive view of the Bank of England than I do of the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is owned and controlled by the largest commercial banks in America, and so obviously it serves them. And the people that sit on the board of the Federal Reserve are often seconded there from the boards of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and they go and sit on the board of the Fed for a few years, and then they go back to Goldman's and JP Morgan's. So the Federal Reserve is clearly run by for the benefit
insiders
of those big banks. Yeah, it's run by insiders for their own benefit, whereas the Bank of England is not run by Barclays and Lloyds. It's more. My impression is it's certainly more independent. It answers to the government to a degree. I'd like to see that.
I think its shareholders and ownership are somewhat opaque, though. I don't think anybody really knows who actually is pulling the lever.
Yeah, well, that's the bit of information I think we'd all like to have, and we all.
But I think we can all make some rational guesses as to which group Rothschilds might be possibly Rothschilds responsible for what's going on.
If the Bank of England is owned by anybody other than the British electorate, then that's clearly something that we should be concerned about. I've sort of had a look at it, and you're right, it's opaque. It's hard to see who owns the Bank of England. But I do think we have this handful of banking families that have been around, multiplying their money and compounding their money for centuries, who have vast amounts of influence, and
that's exorbitant privilege
behind the scenes. Yeah. I think that is an issue, and I don't know how we overcome that problem. But I do think maybe we can nudge policy in the right direction if we get enough people to understand these ideas, to be enthusiastic about these ideas, and go and pester their MPs. Governments do listen when enough people speak out.
Well, unfortunately, I'd have to challenge that one. Having been on a march with maybe 500,000 people, maybe a lot more, several years ago, the government at the time had no interest in the people marching through London against lockdowns, and that was never even reported on the BBC. So,
agreed.
The government never took any notice of the people protesting against the war with Iraq either. So,
no, and I went on that march, but we have had a number of climb downs recently. Labour have rode back considerably from the family farm tax.
But that's only because every single one of their policies has been wrong.
Well, they've got a surprisingly good consistency rate on being wrong, haven't they?
Yeah.
I mean, we have had occasions, and they're notable because they're rare, when public outcry has caused the government to reverse positions. David Cameron reversed his decision to invade Syria, for example, because of public outcry. So there have been a number of examples of governments climbing down. But, what I can guarantee is if we do nothing, then nothing will change.
Sure.
So we have to at least.
Well, you make the effort, but because it's worth making the effort, whether or not you succeed or not, it's a separate issue.
That's it. I agree.
So how could we get some of these ideas into the right hands then?
If only someone would write books about this type of thing.
Well, I mean, so at the risk of being guilty of a shameless plug, people could buy Realonomics, understand the three policies that I'm advocating, and then go and see their MP, go and book to visit him at one of his constituency surgeries, give him a copy of the book.
Before he defects to Reform.
But just give it to Reform.
Yes, Reform is not going to become a depository for failed Tory MPs, says Nigel Farage as he takes in three more. But, I think at least if we can build some public awareness and build some interest in these ideas, who knows? because I think eventually it's going to become obvious that we can't keep going in the direction that we've been going in. Something has to change. And at some point, just sheer self-interest makes people open to ideas, surely.
More specifically, it's the lack of food on the table. That every
Yeah.
society is 3 meals away from a revolution. I think for some people, we're not too far off that now.
I think the only answer here is going to be with the younger generation, isn't it? Because they've got the most to gain by the changes that you're proposing.
And they're arguably the ones that have been most negatively affected by monetary policy over the last decades because
Yeah.
they can't afford anything. I'm going to jump the gun a little bit here, so I'm going to make my media pick an essay from Substack by, let's say, who is it from? I think it's from B. Water is the name of the author, B.E. Water, and it's an essay called The Forgotten Man. And in relation to what we were talking about at the top of the show, certainly quite a while ago, it has a very moving comparison. I mean, it's fantastically well written, but it's got a very moving comparison. It's got a December 1957 front page of the New Yorker magazine and a December 2020 front page of the New Yorker magazine. The 57 one has a mum, a dad, and two children looking with pride at their Christmas tree outside the family home. And the 2020, what year did I say that was? The 2020 one has a single woman of indeterminate racial background at a computer drinking a margarita or a cocktail. There's a cat, and the flat is strewn with rubbish. And it's heartbreaking that you come to the realization that 60 years ago, on one salary, someone could start a family and own a home, and everyone's now, as we discussed earlier, basically squatting in their parents' basement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's distressing to watch, and it doesn't have to be this way. If we don't change our monetary system, then it will carry on being this way. And the reason we're not changing our monetary system is because most people don't really understand how it works and can't envisage an alternative. But there is an alternative. It's something that I outline. It's something I'm really passionate about. And I think we could actually turn this round remarkably quickly if we adopt the right tools. So I'm optimistic that the right tools will do what we want them to do. The challenge, obviously, is
Getting those past vested
tools,
interests.
yeah, and getting those tools into the hands of people that can actually put them to work. That's our challenge.
I think that's such a powerful message that we should really end things on that note. If other than to say,
well, let's really clarify what the book is and where people can get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So the book is called Realonomics: How the Economy Really Works and How We Can Fix It. It's available on Amazon, although I would ask people, if you can, buy it from shepherdwalwyn.com. That's Shepherd with a random A in there. So SHEPHEARD Walwyn, WALWYN.com. You can also see me on YouTube. I've got a channel on YouTube called Realonomics, in which I'm doing a series of short videos, about 10 minutes each, where I'm talking about different ideas and concepts from the book. But it's all laid out from first principles in the book. And it's all written in plain English and common sense terms, so anybody can get this. You can even buy it for your gran. I'm sure she'll love it. But yeah, that this is my job now. It's not enough just to write a book and find a publisher who likes it. Now you have to spend your life marketing it. So that's where I'm at in the process.
So what if you were to set up your own branch of economics, to call it something, and then you just become the teacher? Because obviously in the old days you'd have to go to university, etc.
Yeah.
But everything's changed now. So you could become this pillar of this new form of thinking, and just attract the youth towards your ideas and grow it that way.
That's what I'm trying to do with the YouTube channel.
But I'm thinking, you see, the way people think, they want a certificate at the end of it. They want to feel like they can put it on their CV. So I think you should formalize it into some form of, like, call it, I mean, Realonomics is a great name, but if you formalize the name and formalize a course that you have to go on, and then at the end of it, you get a certificate in this new way of thinking, then you will attract the youth. And that way you might change. One of these younger people might get into government and then start making change.
How do you convince people that that certificate has value? Because obviously, if you get a certificate that says Oxford or Cambridge or LSE on it, everybody understands that has value.
Well, the LSE one doesn't have any value
because that's the way people psychologically think. They think that anyway about certificates. I've done it myself. Like, I've taught courses, put a certificate at the end. They want that certificate. They want to pass an exam at the end of it. People are so competitive towards getting a good grade and getting a certificate that that's what they want. You know,
okay.
And you create the market yourself. See, you will create the market, and then it becomes its own. Its value is that the value here clearly is that the ideas are sound and have value and are different. So you're undervaluing what you've got here, because if you look at the system, you've got a system of corruption in economics where kids aren't taught properly on the one hand, where you end up with a degree, at the end of it, they find that it doesn't work. On your side, you've got economics being taught in a way that actually works, that helps you to see the economy for what it is, potentially to become profitable, to make profits from it. Because if you understand how the economy works, you can make the right decisions and you get a certificate at the end of it. To me, it seems like a no-brainer.
It's an interesting idea. And funnily enough, Steve Keen is doing something similar.
Okay.
He's using his name and his reputation and his YouTube channel to promote a course that he sells. And he's got a very aggressive marketing team who seem to be doing a very good job on his behalf as well. So I might have to find out who that is.
Look, I wish you all success, because I hear your passion, and it's brilliant to get these ideas, which are beautifully simple, that are being rejected out into the open. If you're a young person listening to this, buy a copy of the book. If you're doing economics, take it into your economics teacher and argue with them. Let us know if you're going to write another one, or if there's a follow-up, or if there's anything else that you need. Just let us know, and it'd be great to have you back on the show. We can talk about where we are in the economy, and perhaps fixes at that point, which I'm guessing will probably be very similar. But are you on the socials at all?
Yeah, so I have I have a Substack page. I'm on Twitter as Realonomics. I'm on Substack as Realonomics, and YouTube.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll put all those handles in the show notes, just to say once again, best of luck with the book. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a really interesting discussion, and we look forward to hearing about your success.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. I really enjoyed the discussion as well.
Thanks again.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers, Karim.
Thanks, Tim. Much appreciated. Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thanks, everybody. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do your own research or contact a professional advisor.